Welcome to Crisis in Perception, where we examine the systems shaping our world one book at a time.
Today, we are undertaking a deep dive into a text that it really forces a fundamental recalculation of how we think about political life. It's Hannah Arendt's 1970 work on violence.
And this book, it wasn't written in a vacuum, was it? It was a direct response to a very specific moment.
An incredibly turbulent moment.
Yep.
Provoked by the massive social and political instability of the late 1960s. You had the Vietnam War escalating into this quagmire.
Right, and at home you had this tidal wave of student and civil rights rebellions all over the globe.
Exactly. And hanging over all of it was this perpetual, just paralyzing shadow of the nuclear arms race.
It feels like a time when the language of politics was just breaking down. You know, if the state is using force against its own people and then those people respond with revolutionary violence, what do we even mean when we say the word power?
That's the core of it. Arendt is asking this deceptively simple question. If warfare is becoming technologically obsolete, if no political goal can justify the potential destruction,
And if these huge political systems seem to be seizing up when faced with dissent?
then what exactly is true political power, and how does it really, truly relate to violence?
Her answer is so counterintuitive, and I think that's what makes it so important today.
It is. She argues that power and violence are not, as centuries of political thinkers have claimed, two sides of the same coin. They are, in fact, fundamental opposites.
And that one distinction, seeing violence not as the peak of power, but as its symptom, that changes everything. It completely reframes how we diagnose why our institutions are failing and how we view political action itself.
It does. And why this lens matters now is, I think, crucial for you to understand. We're still living in and often feel trapped by the consequences of these massive, centralized administrative systems, bureaucracies that feel totally unresponsive.
Totally immovable. And we're still watching global conflicts where technology offers this devastating, almost asymmetric superiority.
So Arendt forces us to look beyond the immediate arguments, to stop worrying about who is right or wrong in any given conflict. Instead, she wants us to analyze the mechanisms of power and violence.
So it's a deep, systems-level inquiry. It's about how this whole apparatus actually functions, and maybe why it so consistently produces outcomes that really nobody intended, including systemic failure.
Exactly.
So let's start with the author herself. Who was Hannah Arendt?
Hannah Arendt, she lived from 1906 to 1975, was a German Jewish political theorist. She fled Nazi Germany and became one of the 20th century's most vital and, I should say, controversial public intellectuals.
Right. She's probably most famous for her work, The Origins of Totalitarianism.
Yes, which was this monumental attempt to understand how these completely new forms of political domination, like Nazi Germany and Stalin's Soviet Union, could even arise.
And so when she sat down to write on violence, she was acutely aware that the 20th century had become exactly what Lenin had predicted, right?
A century of wars and revolutions. It was completely defined by the proliferation of violence. But in the late 60s, she was seeing something new, a really strange mix of idealism on one hand and just utter destructive potential on the other.
So she was reacting to two big forces then.
Two massive interlocking forces. First, the terrifying reality of the nuclear age, where violence achieved the capacity for total self-destruction. This effectively rendered all the traditional ideas about war and victory pretty much meaningless.
Yeah, and the second force.
The second was the global student and New Left movements. She saw that in their idealism, and maybe in their frustration, these movements had widely adopted this Mao Zedong slogan that power grows out of the barrel of a gun.
Yeah, that slogan is practically etched into the DNA of modern revolutionary thought. You hear it so often, it sounds like this immutable, cynical law of politics.
And for Arendt, that was a deeply dangerous conceptual error. An error that could actively destroy political action. She was pushing back directly against this intellectual fascination with violence that was so common at the time.
A fascination that went beyond just tactics, right? It was almost philosophical.
Oh, absolutely. For many intellectuals, violence was being elevated to this almost mystical, existential plane. You see this so vividly in Jean-Paul Sartre's introduction to Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth,
where he talks about revolutionary violence as this moment of existential truth.
Yes, as a cleansing force, a means by which man recreates himself. Violence, in that view, wasn't just a tactic. It was somehow necessary for human liberation, for dignity.
So Arendt had to take on not just revolutionaries, but also her philosophical predecessors. She had to distinguish her position from, say, the Marxist tradition, which also saw violence as necessary.
Precisely. And that's a key distinction. The Marxist view, while it advocated for revolutionary upheaval, saw violence as secondary. Marx famously compared revolutionary outbreaks to the labor pangs that come before the birth of a new society.
So the real engine of change wasn't the violence itself.
No. According to orthodox Marxism, it was the fundamental social and economic forces. The ruling class's real power rested on its role in the means of production, not just on physical coercion. Violence was sort of an accelerator for this inevitable historical movement. It wasn't the creative or necessary force that actually defined the outcome.
Okay, so let's try to crystallize Arendt's central, really revolutionary thesis. This is the foundation for our whole deep dive. In plain language, what is the crucial conceptual shift she's asking us to make?
It's this. Political power, true potestas, is not based on command. It's not about coercion or instruments of force. It's relational. It is based entirely on the consent, the support, and the concerted action of a group of people.
So power is what happens when people act together.
Exactly. And conversely, violence is a purely instrumental means. It requires tools, and it needs an immediate, explicit justification, a means-to-an-end relationship.
Which means?
It means that the use of extensive, naked violence by a government is not a sign of supreme power. It's a clear, measurable sign that its power, the consent and support of the people, is breaking down, or maybe has already vanished. They are not equivalents, they are antagonists.
Let's dive into that, starting with the biggest, most existential problem she identifies. This means end failure caused by technology. She calls the situation created by nuclear weapons the obscene culmination of instrumental violence. Why that word obscene?
Because the unprecedented technical development of the implements of violence, specifically thermonuclear weapons, had reached a point where no political goal could conceivably correspond to their destructive potential. No end could justify their actual use.
The means just completely overwhelmed any possible end.
Completely. This is the moment where war, which was traditionally, politics pursued by other means, it just ceases to be a functional political tool. It loses its traditional function as the final, merciless arbiter.
So it hasn't disappeared, obviously, but it's become obsolete in terms of its political utility, and we're left with what she called that apocalyptic chess game between the superpowers.
And that game is played under a devastating paradox. The governing rule is existential. If either wins, it is the end of both. So the rational goal of the arms race can't be victory. It can only be pure deterrence.
And this is where she sees the obvious insanity of the position, the logical trap.
Yes, the arms race is no longer a preparation for war. It is now justified only on the grounds that more deterrence is the surest guarantee of peace. It becomes a self-perpetuating mechanism whose only goal is its own continuation.
So the means, the creation and maintenance of these ever larger nuclear arsenals, have completely replaced the end, which was supposed to be security or peace. The tool just justifies its own existence.
Precisely. Violence is fundamentally instrumental. It is ruled by the means-end category. But when the means, the arsenals, are so overwhelmingly destructive, they stop being tools for political ends, and they become the defining reality of the world.
And the devastating outcome she saw is that the means used to achieve goals often become more relevant to the future than the intended goals themselves.
And this is how the proliferation of nuclear technology becomes this kind of self-justifying machine, which leads her to a really sharp critique of the experts, the so-called scientifically minded brain trusters in government.
The people who manage this obvious insanity.
Yes, the ones who think the unthinkable. Arendt critiques them sharply because they often mistake calculation for actual thought. They don't analyze political reality. They reckon with the consequences of, hypothetically assumed constellations.
So what happens if nation A does X and nation B does Y based on these models? What's the logical flaw there? Why does she say this turns into pseudoscience?
The crucial logical flaw, Arendt points out, is that what starts as a carefully constructed hypothesis, a theoretical model, immediately turns into a fact within the administrative and policy-making sphere.
And that gives birth to a string of similar non-facts, reinforcing the model's own internal consistency. She says it has a hypnotic effect.
A hypnotic effect that, as she writes, puts common sense to sleep. And by common sense, for Arendt, she means our mental organ for perceiving and dealing with reality, with factuality, is what allows us to share a world with other people.
But these expert predictions aren't based on that shared reality.
No, they're merely projections of present automatic processes. They're what's likely to happen if people do not act and if nothing unexpected happens. But political action, by its very nature, is the faculty of beginning something new. It interrupts routine.
So this whole reliance on predictable, calculable projections,
Yeah.
it fails the moment the fecundity of the unexpected enters the picture, which historically is what always happens in revolutionary moments.
Right. The expert class gets trapped in this closed loop of self-referential calculations, justifying the means, more bombs, more centralization, because they can't conceive of a nonlinear political solution or the possibility of genuinely new concerted action breaking the system.
And that closed loop brings us right back to the fundamental conceptual error she has to dismantle, this political theory consensus that equates power with violence.
Which she notes is almost universal. It runs across the entire spectrum, from liberal thinkers to Marxists, from C. Wright Mills to Max Weber and Bertrand de Juvenel.
Right. Max Weber's famous definition of the state, which is still dominant in sociology, is the rule of men over men based on legitimate violence.
Exactly. And Bertrand de Juvenel, a conservative thinker, said the essence of power is simply to command and to be obeyed.
And if you accept that premise, that power is just command backed by the threat of coercion, then there really is no fundamental difference between an order from a policeman and an order from a gunman. Power just equals successful command.
And that is the perception Arendt wants to shatter. She insists that power, strength, force, authority, and violence are 5 distinct phenomena, and if we conflate them, we're blind to political reality.
Okay, let's break this down because they're crucial. Let's start with the two we often confuse with power: strength and force.
Okay, so strength is an individual property. It's something inherent in an object or a person, a powerful personality, a strong building. It's independent of others. But, and this is key, a single strong individual can always be overpowered by the many acting in concert. Strength is solitary. Power is plural.
And force. We use that term all the time in politics, forcing a vote, political forces.
Arendt reserves the term force for non-human natural phenomena. So think of the forces of nature or the force of circumstances. It's energy released by physical or social movements that feel, inevitable or uncontrollable.
Okay, now for the concepts that are related to control, we have violence and authority. How does she define violence?
Violence is purely instrumental. It's closest to strength because the tools it uses are designed to multiply natural individual strength. Violence requires implements, guns, bombs, clubs, technical infrastructure. It's always a means to an end. It's the tool you use when other means have failed or just aren't available.
So if a police officer relies on their gun to get compliance, they're using violence. But if they rely on the uniform and their position,
They're relying on authority. Authority is based on unquestioning recognition. It doesn't need coercion, which is violence, or persuasion, which is rational argument. Think of the relationship between a parent and a child, or the authority of an office, like the Roman Senate.
So obedience is given willingly because the source of the command is seen as legitimate.
Exactly. And she makes this fascinating side note. The great enemy of authority is contempt and laughter, not necessarily opposition or rebellion.
That's a profound distinction. If a government is held in contempt, its authority is gone even before any violence breaks out. Okay, now for the crucial one, power. If it's none of those other things, what is it?
Power is the most crucial definition. It corresponds to the human ability to act in concert. It is never an individual property. It belongs to a group, and it only exists as long as that group holds together. It relies, fundamentally, on numbers and on consent or support.
That old Roman maxim, potestas in populo power, resides in the people.
That's the key. If the people withdraw their consent, the power evaporates entirely, regardless of how many instruments of violence the leadership has.
I think we need a concrete analogy here. Let's imagine a king. We say he's a powerful man. Arendt would say that's just a metaphor.
Exactly. The king has strength, maybe charisma. He commands instruments of violence, his army. But his power is derived from the group that empowers him. The army, the nobility, the civil service, the majority of people who consent to his rule.
So if those groups withdraw their support, his power just vanishes.
It vanishes. And the moment he has to rely solely on his instruments of violence, or Arendt argues he is no longer exercising power. He is demonstrating the extent of his weakness and the breakdown of his political base.
So the reliance on brute force is a symptom of political illness, the evaporation of consent, not a measure of political health.
And this distinction leads to her core insight about revolution. Governments that are based exclusively on instrumental violence have, maybe counterintuitively, never truly existed for very long.
Right. Even the most brutal regime, the one whose chief instrument is terror, still requires a power base. It needs people who are willing to execute the terror, who are willing to inform on their neighbors.
Precisely. The superiority of government violence is absolute, only as long as commands are obeyed and its forces, the soldiers, the police, the party loyalists, are willing to use their weapons against the population.
The moment that power disintegrates, the moment consent is gone, or those forces decide their opinion aligns with the rebels.
The instruments of violence change hands with shocking speed. You see this in events like the Hungarian Revolution of 1956, which she often cited. The entire political landscape changed in just a matter of days.
Because revolutions aren't usually made by rebels successfully matching the state's destructive capacity. That gap is usually enormous.
No, revolutions are possible only when the established government's power structure is already hollowed out, meaning its political support has already dissolved from within. The core issue is always obedience, which is decided by opinion and the number of people who share it, not by the sheer magnitude of the command.
And she saw the French student rebellion of 1968, which was initially nonviolent, as a kind of textbook case. It revealed the deep vulnerability of the entire system.
It did. The French system disintegrated rapidly because the huge party bureaucracies and the central government's power just dissolved from the bottom up. De Gaulle, the supposed strongman, was forced to appeal to the army for support. That's a key distinction. He didn't just issue commands backed by violence.
The system collapsed because, as she put it, the majority clearly refuses to use its power and overpower the disruptors. The system was structurally sound, but it was politically hollow.
Exactly. And let's underline the ultimate implication of this. If power relies on numbers and consent, and violence is what you use when power is gone, what does that make tyranny?
Well, tyranny, rule by one against all, has to be the most violent form of government imaginable.
Right, because it must rely entirely on instrumental means to enforce compliance. But it is simultaneously the least powerful form of government, because it fundamentally lacks numbers, concerted action, and public consent. It is perpetually fragile. The tyrant is in constant fear of losing the loyalty of the few people who hold the actual guns.
That just flips the entire perception of political strength on its head. When we see a state using overwhelming violence, we should be seeing fragility and desperation, not strength.
And following from that definition, violence is instrumental. It always requires justification by the end it pursues. And here Arendt introduces a critical philosophical separation. The difference between something being justifiable and something being legitimate.
We tend to use those terms interchangeably in political debates. What is the Arendtian distinction?
Violence can be justifiable, for instance, in self-defense, or when you're facing immediate danger. The means-end relationship is clear and immediate. If I use a tool to protect myself, the justification is obvious.
But it can never be legitimate.
It can never be legitimate. Legitimacy, Arendt explains, has to derive from the past. It flows from the original getting together, the initial consent and agreement that forms a political community and its laws. It flows from the structure of governance itself, not from the immediate results of an action.
Okay, so legitimacy is about origin and consent, while justification is about consequence and necessity.
Exactly. And this limits the utility of violence massively. Because it's purely instrumental. Violence is terrible at promoting long-term causes. You can't bomb your way to a stable democracy, or use violence to create historical progress, or build a lasting revolution purely on destruction.
It's only rational, then, when it's used for short-term, immediate goals.
That's when it's effective. It functions as a disruptive signal, a massive, unavoidable red flag that something is fundamentally broken.
That seems to be its main modern function in the hands of dissidents.
Yes. Art quotes Conor Cruise O'Brien, who, citing an earlier Irish agitator, suggests violence can serve to dramatize grievances and bring them to public attention. He says it's sometimes the only way of ensuring a hearing for moderation.
So if all other channels for action are blocked, a violent eruption becomes the only way to make an otherwise inert system pay attention.
And we saw this pattern repeat in the late 60s. The French student riots led to sweeping education reform. The Columbia riots led to campus structural changes. Arendt acknowledges that violence pays, it gets results.
But she has a profound warning there, doesn't she?
She does. It pays indiscriminately. It doesn't just achieve rational, needed reforms. Because the goal of the established power is often just to restore calm, to restore administrative normalcy. They will often yield quickly to easy, superficial, or even nonsensical and obviously damaging demands.
Like admitting unqualified students or creating soul courses, as she mentioned.
Exactly. The establishment is incentivized to accept a quick, meaningless transaction that removes the symptom, the violence, rather than confronting the deep structural failures that caused the rage in the first place. The short-term rationality of violence for the rebel is matched by the short-term, self-defeating rationality of compliance for the establishment.
And Arendt saw this violence being justified by two huge, pervasive narratives of her era.
Yes, the philosophical narrative of inevitable progress and the pseudoscientific narrative of biological determinism.
Let's start with progress. This is the idea she inherited from thinkers like Marx and Hegel, that history is this linear, automatic force leading to an inevitable, better future.
Right. This idea that nothing unexpected can ever happen, only the necessary results of forces we already know, is what Arendt calls a speculative refuge from reality. The concept of progress provides this comfortable guarantee. It tells us what to do next. Let us develop what we have into something better, greater, etc.
Which justifies the modern faith in relentless growth, more and more, bigger and bigger, even when that growth leads directly to disaster, like the nuclear threat or global pollution.
And she argues this narrative is factually refuted by the 20th century, which was defined by the totally unexpected. No one in 1900 predicted the Holocaust or a student rebellion based on moral rather than economic grounds.
The idea of linear progress denies human freedom and action, then, the capacity to begin something new.
It reduces human beings to mere cogs in a machine driven by historic necessity. This narrative is politically destructive because it justifies relentless expansion and centralization, regardless of the consequences.
What about the biological justification, the idea that violence is just this innate aggressive instinct that we have to release?
She dismisses this thoroughly. This narrative relies heavily on what she calls theriomorphism, using highly specific contextual studies of animal behavior like rats and apes to explain complex political human actions. She finds the idea that we need to periodically release our instinctual aggression to avoid psychological damming up to be illogical.
She compares it to claiming that the sensation of hunger increases with the decrease of hungry people.
Right. Political violence requires preparation, concerted action, and implements. It's not a simple reflex.
So if it's not biological instinct, where does the violence actually come from?
Arendt argues that violence, when used by the oppressed, most often springs from rage. And rage is profoundly political. It's triggered precisely when the sense of justice is offended because conditions could be changed. The political structure is clearly pliable, but they are not.
So rage is a reaction not to necessity, but to perceived deliberate failure and especially to hypocrisy.
Precisely. Rage is the response when reason, laws, and words are used as a trap, meant to conceal institutional failure rather than to reveal truth. The desire to unmask the establishment's pretense of rationality is a powerful, morally driven motivator for violent outbreaks.
So she's not saying rage is irrational.
Not at all. She states clearly that rage and the violence that sometimes accompanies it belongs among the natural human emotions, and that trying to suppress it entirely would dehumanize or emasculate us. It is the human reaction to the denial of the possibility of action.
That provides a crucial psychological link. If you're denied the faculty of action, the only thing left is the destructive, immediate power of rage.
And that leads directly to the mechanism that most effectively denies action: bureaucracy. Arendt makes this powerful connection that the attraction of violence increases directly with the bureaucratization and centralization of public life.
We often think of bureaucracy as inefficient, maybe annoying, but not necessarily tyrannical. The art calls it the rule by nobody.
And that rule by nobody is, in her view, the most tyrannical form of government imaginable. In a traditional tyranny, you have a visible enemy, a monarch, a dictator whose will can be opposed, whose person can be removed.
But in a bureaucracy, responsibility can't be localized. The enemy can't be identified. When things go wrong, everyone just points to policy, to procedure, to the system itself.
Or to the general flow of documents. So if you are a citizen with a grievance, there is literally nobody left with whom you can argue, to whom you can present grievances, or on whom the pressures of democratic power can be exerted.
The system is designed to be self-regulating, anonymous, and ultimately unassailable by political action.
Correct. And this systemic setup leads to what she terms Praxissentzug, the severe frustration or suspension of the human faculty of action. Action, the ability to begin something new and act in concert with others, is the very definition of political life for her.
So when all the channels for meaningful political action are blocked by these massive anonymous bureaucracies, violence becomes the default response.
A desperate and often nihilistic response to relieve that profound frustration. You can see this playing out today in everything from trying to deal with a massive university administration to just getting a response from a centralized government agency. You are fighting against a system, not a person.
It creates a unique kind of political alienation.
It does. Arendt observed a fascinating distinction between rebels in the East and West during the Cold War. Rebels in Eastern Europe, like in Czechoslovakia, demanded basic freedom of speech, thought, assembly as necessary preliminaries to political action. They wanted the tools to begin.
But Western rebels already had those rights.
They did, yet they felt those rights no longer provided channels for authentic action because of the sheer size and rigidity of their institutions. Massive political parties, centralized governments, huge corporations.
So their frustration was that the preliminary conditions for action no longer enabled action itself. You could speak freely, but nobody was listening, and the system was just too large to be moved.
And the only way to interrupt the flow of the machine was to throw a wrench in it, which is violence.
Let's shift our focus and use a systems lens to see how these dynamics aren't described perpetuate themselves, often toward harmful outcomes. Who are the key players in the late 60s system she analyzes, and what incentives keep this dysfunctional machine running?
We can definitely map out the actors and the mechanics that perpetuate this cycle of lost power and instrumental violence.
Okay, starting with the actors involved. It seems the system is dominated by these centralized, monolithic governing systems.
Yes, federal governments, massive political party bureaucracies, which she notes are functionally similar in the Soviet East and the bureaucratic West, and complex administrative bodies like university administrations.
Which started acting less like academic institutions and more like opaque corporate managers.
Right. Then you have the brain trusters and experts. These are the scientifically minded people, often sociologists or mathematicians, who calculate possibilities, but, as we discussed, confuse their theoretical models with reality.
And their incentive is internal consistency. Their logical structure has to hold up, which means treating hypotheses as established facts.
And this pseudoscience has a hypnotic effect, effectively overriding political common sense and allowing massive destructive projects like the Vietnam War to continue based on these calculated but detached models.
And finally, the rebellious. Arendt draws a fine analytical line between them, doesn't she?
She does. You have the white student rebels, often motivated by purely moral concerns, and almost Kantian refusal to become the good German who ignores state crimes like Vietnam.
Yeah.
They acted out of moral conscience against hypocrisy.
And then you have the groups motivated by tangible, specific interests.
Like the Black Power students, who often organized as classic interest groups. They demanded measurable, localized results, like lower academic standards at places like Cornell to ensure representation. And Arendt observed the establishment often found it easier to deal with interest plus violence than with disinterested, purely moral, nonviolent dissent.
Because interests are negotiable.
Interests are negotiable.
Okay, let's move to the incentives driving behavior. What keeps the actors doing what they're doing, even if it leads to, as she says, insanity?
Well, for the superpowers, the dominant incentive is sheer deterrence, achieved through the escalating acquisition of destructive means. The incentive structure is a self-fulfilling prophecy. Because the other side is deterring, we must deter more.
Which creates the obvious insanity of the arms race, where technological capacity drives political justification instead of the other way around.
Exactly. And for the established power, the administrators and bureaucrats, their core incentive when faced with dissent is immediate tranquility.
Right. They're incentivized to yield to easy, non-structural, or even nonsensical demands, the superficial reforms, the easily created soul courses, to quickly quell violence and restore administrative calm.
And they avoid confronting the deep structural issues that cause the frustration in the first place, primarily the massive party bureaucracies that crush the capacity for political action. A quick tactical surrender is easier than admitting the entire system is paralyzed.
And for the rebels themselves, beyond the moral rage, what's the positive incentive of collective violent action?
Arendt highlights the intense momentary vitalization and sense of collective life it provides. It creates an extreme form of group coherence, that brotherhood on the battlefield or on the street.
A feeling of intense shared purpose.
Yes, where life itself is surging upward. It's a potent, if transitory, incentive that stands in stark opposition to the loneliness and political impotence felt in mass society and bureaucratic anonymity. It's a fleeting moment of true political power acting in concert, even if the means they use are violent.
So beyond the immediate incentives, there are these underlying narratives that function as unexamined assumptions, guiding everyone.
Absolutely. The first, which motivates some rebels, is the Malphanon rhetoric.
Yeah.
The belief that only violence pays, that if they use conventional political means, they will fail, so they must resort to the instrumental hammer.
And for the establishment.
Perhaps the most dangerous narrative for them and for democratic politics as a whole is the belief in enlightened self-interest. This is the idea that if we simply calculate rationally, individuals will make decisions that benefit the long-term collective good. Arendt is highly skeptical of this.
Why?
She believes self-interest, tied as it is to human mortality and short time horizons, cannot realistically reckon in long-range terms for the good of the public world, res publica.
So the political maxim, near as my shirt, but nearer as my skin, always wins out.
Exactly. The self-interested party, whether an individual, a corporation, or a government committee, will always prioritize immediate, measurable gain over the long-term, abstract health of the communal structure.
Deterioration of infrastructure, the consequences of pollution, those might take years to manifest, but profit or relief from pressure is today.
Which is why political problems tied to interests are so resistant to rational long-term argument and why the belief in enlightened self-interest is politically insufficient.
And underlying all of this, tying back to the nuclear issue, is the unquestioned belief in perpetual technological progress.
This narrative provides that comfortable, speculative refuge, guaranteeing that nothing altogether new and totally unexpected can happen. Arendt shows this belief justifies relentless, automatic growth, the more and more of bigger and bigger mentality that shrinks the public realm and necessitates greater administrative centralization, even when that growth leads directly to disaster. The narrative of progress becomes a moral imperative for growth, regardless of the political cost.
Let's examine the system as a closed circuit. What are the harmful feedback loops that reinforce these destructive outcomes, making the problem worse over time?
The most potent is what we could call the violence impotence loop. This begins when power is lost, or when an authority perceives itself as losing control. That loss of power becomes a direct psychological temptation to substitute instrumental violence for it.
Right, like the police actions during the 1968 Democratic Convention in Chicago, where authorities used brutal force because they felt their political grip was slipping.
But the violence itself, when substituted for power, doesn't restore power. It actually accelerates its destruction.
It leads to generalized impotence and the eventual destruction of all power. And when violence triumphs absolutely and destroys all power, what remains is terror.
Terror is the ultimate form of government, established when violence does not abdicate but remains in full, continuous control. And its effectiveness depends almost entirely on social atomization.
Meaning every kind of organized, concerted opposition has to disappear.
The system works to sever all political and social bonds between people, ensuring that they cannot act in concert, which is the definition of power. This atomization is maintained by the omnipresence of the informer and the arbitrary application of violence.
You mentioned Solzhenitsyn's documentation of Stalin's regime in the First Circle. That illustrates the horrifying mechanism of how terror works, doesn't it?
It shows how the police state starts devouring its own children. Yesterday's loyal executioner becomes today's victim. Nobody is safe, and nobody can trust anyone. This leads not just to oppression, but to the deep systemic paralysis of the whole country.
Functionaries, knowing they could be next, become incapable of making decisions or taking initiative.
And power, which thrives on concerted action and initiative, disappears entirely. The administration becomes ineffective and utterly brittle.
The second major loop we have to look at is the centralization trap, which is the political structure that feeds the bureaucracy.
Monopolization of power through centralization, say, the federal government overpowering state functions, or the executive eroding the legislative branch, causes political power to dry up or ooze away from its authentic local sources.
Because power, as we've said, requires people to act in concert at a local level.
So when local action is removed and replaced by administration from a central point, the strength and resiliency of the system are insidiously destroyed. They leak drop by drop from the institutions. The country becomes incredibly vulnerable to widespread management failure and the decay of basic public services.
The power to fix local problems, traffic, local policing, infrastructure decay, has been drained to the center where it can't be properly exercised.
Because the central administration is too far removed and too bureaucratic to generate new action or consent in those specific locales. The centralization of power paradoxically leads to the impotence of the entire nation in the face of local, manageable problems.
Let's bring Arndt's systems analysis into the modern day. If power relies on concerted action and centralization leads to this tyranny by nobody, what patterns do we see repeating in our contemporary institutions, especially under the relentless pressure of technological change?
The first, and I think the most urgent, is the enduring technology and progress paradox. The split she identified between the I will, our political and ethical goals, and the I can, our scientific capability, has only gotten wider.
Our relentless technological progress continues to create existential risks. Advanced bioweapons, more efficient surveillance and manipulation tools, and of course, the continued nuclear threats.
And we can achieve the impossible with massive teamwork like global networking, complex space missions, or developing AI models, yet we are often helpless to end a war in a small regional conflict or manage climate crisis mitigation effectively.
Or even manage the basic functionality of our cities. The paradox of competence is that we're incredibly effective at specialized technical feats, yet utterly incompetent at basic political management and generating the public consensus needed to solve shared problems.
It feels like the I will has not only parted company with the I can, but the capacity to act. The I can now often dictates the political will. We feel compelled to do whatever we are technically capable of doing, regardless of the political or ethical goals.
And this drives the second major implication: the unmanageable mass society.
The automatic, inescapable results of bigness and mass society needs are visible everywhere. The decay of public services, traffic congestion, air pollution, police inefficiency, failing public transport systems, school decline. These are not fundamentally failures of morality or individual laziness.
They're the automatic physical consequences of centralized structures that have simply become unmanageable due to sheer scale. They represent the atrophy of political power at the local level.
The system is too big to be steered effectively, even by people with good intentions. It's the rule by nobody manifesting in a decaying public infrastructure. And Arendt noticed the political response to this beginning to emerge, a new brand of nationalism and resentment against bigness.
Which isn't necessarily driven by traditional political ideology, but by a worldwide frustration with over-centralized, unresponsive administration.
Exactly. We see this globally today in the resurgence of regionalism, the desire for local political control, or even separatist movements. Groups whose assimilation was once a given are now turning against the centralized power in London, Paris, or Washington. They're not necessarily rebelling against democracy, they are rebelling against unmanageability.
And Arendt saw the U.S. as a prime, cautionary example of accelerating into this centralization mistake.
Despite being founded on the genius of division of powers and federalism, designed explicitly to prevent power from accumulating in one place, the U.S. threw itself headlong into centralization, draining power from states and local communities.
And that impotence plays out when true, concerted political power, grassroots efforts, local campaigns are crushed not by an opposing political philosophy, but by the massive internal party bureaucracy.
The machinery of administration prefers a predictable loss to a genuine, unexpected shift in power. The power revealed by concerted public action is nullified by the rule of nobody.
And finally, she provides an essential tool for analyzing rage and ideology in modern conflict, particularly around race or identity. She distinguishes sharply between prejudice and racism as ideology.
Right. In the civil rights movement, she notes that nonviolent protests were effective at dealing with prejudices, which are socially conditioned beliefs that can yield under the pressure of political power, opinion, and law.
But racism, whether white or black, when it evolves into a full-fledged ideology like James Forman's manifesto, which objects to immutable biological facts like skin color, that logically leads to murder.
Because if your objection is to the inherent existence of the object, which cannot be changed, the only ultimate political solution against its object is extermination.
So the danger of violence in racial or ideological conflict is that it risks transforming a manageable political problem prejudice, which yields to power, into a murderous eliminationist ideology that destroys the political capacity to solve the issue.
It creates a self-fulfilling prophecy. Arendt observed that while many of the riots of the 60s were rational protests against genuine grievances, the white backlash reaction, while initially rational in some cases, risked quickly developing into a violent racist ideology where the demand for law and order becomes a mere facade for systematic eliminationist oppression. Once the conflict moves from grievances to immutable identity, violence serves the ideological goal of elimination, not negotiation.
Art's analysis in On Violence provides such an essential, critical frame for our channel's focus on crisis and perception. Specifically, she gives us the tools to identify systemic crises beneath the surface narratives of political conflict.
Absolutely. And the most chilling connection, which we have to constantly keep in mind when analyzing complex systems, is how power is hidden in neutral processes.
Bureaucracy, the rule by nobody.
It presents itself as objective administration, an efficient, neutral management system. But Arendt insists this neutrality is a dangerous illusion. It is a silent tyranny where the political capacity for action is intentionally or unintentionally suspended.
The absence of recognizable power doesn't mean the absence of control. It just means the locus of control is diffuse, automatic, and therefore impervious to challenge.
Which connects directly to the idea of systems versus individual blame. When things fail, when infrastructure collapses, when police overstep, we are quick to assign individual blame. A corrupt mayor, a bad officer.
But while that anger and rage are natural, morally justified human responses to genuine grievances, the systemic harm is perpetuated when power holders substitute instrumental violence for lost political power.
The failure isn't the rage of the oppressed, but the self-defeating mechanism, the boomerang effect, where unchecked violence destroys power, leading only to greater atomization and institutional paralysis. The system is rigged to fail by converting power into weakness.
And finally, Arendt deconstructs the moral narratives embedded in institutions.
That unquestioned belief in linear, continuous, unlimited progress, often embedded not only in liberal but also in socialist and communist thought, functions as a powerful, politically unifying narrative. But it's ultimately a false refuge from reality.
It guarantees that nothing altogether new and totally unexpected can happen.
And Arendt uses the totally unexpected nature of the morally motivated student rebellion to show this narrative is empirically refuted by the century's events, and yet it persists, justifying relentless, often disastrous growth, the more and more of bigger and bigger mentality that actively shrinks the political public realm where meaningful action must occur.
So, to wrap up, Arendt forces us to unlearn a deeply entrenched conceptual consensus that has governed political thinking for centuries. The flawed equation that power equals violence.
Right.
True political power, she shows us, is not a possession or an instrument. It is relational. It is the capacity of people to act together, in concert, giving their consent and support.
And seeing that distinction is just vital for understanding political life. It reveals that violence, the purely instrumental means, can never create power. It can only destroy it.
So when power declines, when consent disappears and commands are no longer obeyed, violence becomes a desperate but ultimately self-defeating temptation.
Its victory is not a victory for governance. It leads to atomization, impotence, and political paralysis. Violence is fundamentally incapable of creating new political beginnings.
Arendt defines action as the human response to natality, the fact that we are born as newcomers, capable of beginning something new, of performing the unexpected. But the modern world, dominated by this relentless, automatic, centralized growth, this more and more of bigger and bigger, that makes society unmanageable. It's leading to the disastrous shrinkage of the public realm. It's crushing the capacity for action.
We are reduced to reactions against a system too vast to engage with. And this leaves us with a provocative final question to take away.
If action is the beginning of the new, and the channels for traditional political action are blocked by bureaucracy and centralization,
Are the chaotic eruptions of rage and frustration we see today, the riots, the localized rebellions, the resentment against bigness, are they the beginnings of a new example, maybe manifesting in small, local sectors where authentic power can still gather and concerted action can be born?
or are they merely the death pangs of the essential human faculty of political action, overwhelmed and extinguished by the system's automatism and the tyranny of bureaucracy?
That, Arendt suggests, is the ongoing political struggle for us to observe and act upon.
We are deeply indebted to Hannah Arendt for her critical insights in On Violence.
If you found these ideas valuable, we encourage you to read the book yourself and support the author, or check your local library for free access.
For a shorter visual overview of this topic, see the mini explainer linked in the description.
If you enjoy this kind of systems-level analysis, please like, subscribe, and comment with books or topics you'd like us to explore next.